Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Kirby Russia, where I, Tim Kirby, an American who's worked in the Russian media for a heck of a long time, talk to you about what things look like in Russia from a Russian standpoint, from an internal standpoint and insider view. But anyways, guys, I'm kind of sick of talking about a certain war. It is topic number one in Russia, so completely avoiding it would be illogical if we're going to talk about the news and events. My pen almost tried to escape from me. But today I kind of wanted to talk about communism, because I saw there were some arguments about it on my Telegram channel, Tim Kirby Russia Hardcore, where you're watching this live, or where you could go to watch the next live stream if you're watching this after the fact somewhere else. But anyways, I really, after you've lived in a former communist country, in fact maybe the quintessential former communist country, and you've had the chance to talk to a lot of people over the years, and I've been here for like 20 years, so I've had essentially the opportunity to speak to a wide span of people whose lives were really rooted in the communist period, who were sort of the kids of the USSR, which would be like my generation, people who were born in the USSR technically, but don't really remember it, and certainly weren't working adults or anything like that. And then you, of course, see people who were born after the USSR, who for them that was just some historical phase, and they're not really that aware of it, and it didn't touch them very personally. So I kind of wanted to start this thing off by saying too that when it gets to YouTube, right, when you talk about communism, I think you kind of go to two extremes. You get in some sort of like Ben Shapiro, only like super hardcore capitalism or some kind of libertarianism or whatever. You get that kind of person who they just don't want to hear anything, they don't want to talk about it. Or then you get into, I would say, the communist side of things. Is probably the best person to hear talk about communism would be Professor Richard Wolff, if you'd like to hear him. He's at least very good at speaking, I'll put it that way. So I'm not a believer in the communist system, despite the fact that I'm wearing red today. Maybe that was a mistake, talking about this video wearing red. But then the reason for that is that I've lived in Russia. Like, when I was 16, 17, 18, a lot of that kind of Marxist stuff made a lot more sense. Then after you start living in Russia, you're like, wow, this was not the way to go. But I can see that there were some benefits to it. As I saw in the chat, one of my least favorite sort of mantras is the one that I saw from the time when I was a kid up until I left America, and I still see from mostly Americans, not so much Europeans, although I'm sure the English-speaking ones probably say it too. The mantra, communism doesn't work. That's one that I heard over and over and over again, probably on purpose, thanks to our friends in the mainstream media, but communism doesn't work. And as someone who is not an advocate for communism whatsoever, I can tell you it does work. Just not as well as alternatives. What do I mean by that? Well, if communism doesn't work, then Cuba and North Korea, which are both sort of like Soviet communist states for the most part, they still have the old-time structure. Whereas, as we saw with China, they really liberalized their economy, and now they're kind of a blend of things. It's hard to really say that they reflect some sort of Soviet economy the way they are nowadays. Of course, they have some central planning, but the means of production aren't exactly entirely held by the Communist Party, and things are more organic and so on and so forth. But there are at least, these two countries that still stick to their Soviet communism, and they're still going, and that ain't changing. So when it comes to if communism inherently didn't work, there'd have to be some sort of like, what would it be? Sell-by date? Like in 25 years, the regime will collapse, or like with the Soviet Union, what it wind up being. So 1917 to the 80s, also 90, plus 6 would be 70, so 70 some years, 70 years plus, that would be the expiration date. Now, so the whole thing of communism doesn't work is a bunch of malarkey. However, I can say that communism does not work as well as alternatives. Why? Because, as we've talked about on this channel many times before, there's a lot of, sanctions and pressure from the outside, from the West, and all these attempts by the West to destroy Russia and all this and that. And for a lot of people, they seem kind of silly because they're not working as offered, or they seem to be backfiring on the Europeans. Some people believe that this was on purpose to punish the Europeans and break them even further. Who knows? But I can tell you one thing, that those whole sanctions and economic measures and isolation, that worked during the Cold War. This comes from somewhere. So that kind of begs a question. Well, why did stuff like that work during the Cold War? Or like when especially they weighed a lot of sanctions on the early and other means of penance on the early Soviet Union. That's what partially caused a lot of the suffering from hunger in the 1930s, or maybe a big part. Why does that have no effect on modern Russia? Is it purely technological? I don't think so. I think it could be systemic. One of the things that they think even brought down the Soviet Union was when the gas prices really collapsed. They were at a sort of a high in the 70s when there was the fuel crisis or whatever they called it. I forget, or was it an energy crisis of the 70s? I forget the proper term. You can write me in the chat. Because remember, if you want to talk to me, you just go anywhere on Tim Kirby Russia Hardcore. You write any sort of comment anywhere, and it goes into a magical place that's called the chat, and I'll see it. And later you can call in and talk to me after we're done talking. But give my spiel, as I call it. But anyways, so a lot of the things that the West has tried to do to Russia that seem silly now all worked against the Soviet Union, because apparently the Soviet Union was definitely not a gas station masquerading as a country. But its economy was really freaking dependent on this oil and gas as opposed to modern day Russia, right? So, it shows that communism with the same sort of country, which is actually smaller, because the Soviet Union had a lot more republics, it had more people, so in theory it'd have even more resources. You have this resource-rich country, and yet it couldn't behave competitively on a global stage. Now the system that we have today in Russia, which you don't really know how to categorize. The problem is, when I was a schoolboy, we had, capitalism was a system of the sort of free market, or where the means of production was in private hands, not the government. And then communism was the system where the means of production was purely controlled by the state. And something in between was called fascism. But then that makes modern day Russia and China and a lot of other places economic fascists. So I don't think that that's quite maybe the appropriate term, or a term that you'd want to, because I'll put it this way, neither China or Russia are socially fascist, okay, or spiritually or something else, but the way my textbooks of the 1980s and 90s defined everything, that's what they said. So I don't even really know how to define or put into words what the modern Russian economy is like, but it could, let's just say, put up with a beating. It's flexible, it's dynamic, which the Soviet Union wasn't. So, the kind of thing that another story that I think is important that a lot of people don't hear about is, well, people know that in St. Petersburg, all the addresses are goofy. Okay, that's very famous in St. Petersburg. You'll have a stairwell to a building. And this is very telling about early communism and why I don't support it. Because it really suits that attitude. But anyway, so in St. Petersburg, which was the capital city of the Russian Empire at the time, year 1917, after the revolution, all of these different stairwells and all of these buildings, at the time, during the revolution, they all had logical, consistent numbers, right? And then after that, it's crazy. Like, you'll have 22, 87, 46, 3, all right next to each other. And in the next one, 7, 8, 9, 207. No logic, rhyme, or reason. Well, there is a rhyme or reason, because after the Russian Revolution, happened, well, the communists were supposed to be for the people, for the working masses. Well, what was the first thing they did? It was eat the rich. So they went in and took all the apartments away from all of the rich people, or at least took most of them away, and they sort of subdivided apartments into one-room sub-apartments. So that's where you get this weird thing, is that all of a sudden, these sort of big, luxurious apartments for large families or wealthy families were sort of subdivided into all these different little chunks, And then at some point, especially after communism ended, because they remained, those chunks remained till the end of communism. After communism ended, then some of the chunks got reunited and some didn't, and that's where we're at today. And that's why the addresses are insane, because they had to make sense during the big cut up of the 1920s. But anyways, long story short, it really shows the mentality that I really, I hear from a lot of people who discuss communism is that, well, what's the first thing we do when we get power? And there seems to be some problems in terms of housing and homes, right? Maybe even to an extent, the housing crisis that the Russians are facing at the end of the 19th century, maybe it hasn't even quite been resolved, potentially. Maybe we're only going to approach that within the next 10 years. But the solution was take it from other people, cut it up, and put up some like fake walls. Not load-bearing walls, your interior walls. Shove some of those up and then force a bunch of weird people to all live in one place and share the same kitchen. That's a very communist way of looking at things. Rather than sort of build or create, you kind of have take and subdivide. Of course, later we get into the Khrushchev period where they sort of wanted to build more, right? So they had the crisis after World War II, where there were a lot of the homes and everything was blown up in the western part of the country, especially the closer it was to, say, Poland, Germany. So, Khrushchev comes in and they're like, well, we have a housing problem here. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to build the famous Khrushchev apartment buildings. And, what was the mission? What did the communists see? There's nothing left to cut up and subdivide. They had to make more. So what were they going to do? And of course, during Stalin's time, they did build buildings, a significant number, but still. Stalin actually gave people a bit more of a luxurious option, but some people would say you had to be very loyal to the party. Who knows? But regardless, Khrushchev basically used, because remember, there's only one employer in the Soviet Union. So he used the architects of the time to sort of come up with measurements for the minimum amount of distance you'd need to, say, walk in your home. The minimum amount of distance to take off a coat and shoes in a hallway. The minimum amount of distance to have a bathtub. The minimum amount of distance for you to walk into, again, this bathroom and have a sink and a toilet and a bathtub if it's one of those. Or the minimum amount of difference you'd need at the set of the magical separate toilet room that they usually do in Russian architecture, so on, and for the kitchen and so on and so forth. Ironically, though, in Poland, they wanted to punish the Poles, and so that way they wouldn't have political conversations in their kitchen. So the Polish kitchens of the Khrushchev sort of design were always teeny tiny to keep people from socializing in them, supposedly. But anyways, so you get this thing where then, Khrushchev, and they built a lot of housing for people, and everyone says, oh, that's so great. Oh, the communists, they built so much housing for everyone. But if you think about it, well, I guess it's good to have something when you have nothing, especially after World War II. But you think about it, they gave you the absolute fucking minimum that they could give you, if you think about it. You know what I mean? So if you talk to people who have a positive opinion about, communism, you have to kind of think about how they're living. Because, I don't know, maybe I have a boomer, although I'm not a boomer, but a boomer view of things, even though through the economic problems that are in a lot of the world, and the fact that housing globally is actually getting more and more expensive, unless you're living in like a coffin apartment in like Singapore, you're probably not going to be able to do more than like with Khrushchev. Even in Russia, if you're just some guy who works with his hands, and you have access to a plot of land, you would be able to build yourself a better home than especially the first generation of Khrushchev apartments. Okay? So on the one hand, it's cool that, like, yeah, you're in the Soviet Union and everyone gets a free apartment. Again, nothing in the Soviet Union was free because you were obligated to work. You had to work 40 hours a week. Okay, so nothing was free. It was just the difference of whether we do it in the Western way, where everyone works and they pay taxes on various different things, or in the Soviet Union, you just have to work and therefore you get stuff. So it works out basically the same, long story short. And so, yeah, it sucks. And you could think, oh, well, Tim, Maybe they just gave everyone the minimum, and then people could sort of improve their living on their own or redecorate. Well, if the Soviet Union wasn't so goofy and there weren't deficits of everything, then you probably could really customize your apartment and make them look nice, like people do in modern Russia, because they have the freedom to do so and the resources and this, that, and the other. So again, the more you look back on communism, it's not something of it doesn't work, because it does, just doesn't work well, or evil or whatever. I can see the appeal of it, but when you just compare it to modern Russia, like, the country is so much better without it. The richest, in terms of resources, country in the world was pretty dirt poor for the average person for 70 years, until it ended. And then very quickly, if you think about it relatively, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, you know, what did it take, about like 2 terms of Putin before things started to really pick up for the average person? So, you know, guys, I don't know. This whole communism thing, I really, really don't think it is the way to go. Especially, like I said, about how the first thing the communists did was cut up all the rich people's stuff rather than actually building anything. And that's always what I hear when people talk about it. I also generally hear, like I said, I mentioned Professor Richard Wolff, who I think is probably one of the better speakers about communism. But regardless, whenever you hear someone who's really pro-communist speak, they talk about like the criticism of capitalism, right? That Marxism is a criticism of capitalism. Cool, but you can criticize freaking anything, you know? And it's kind of like the thing with the underpants gnomes. It's like the underpants gnomes believe that, it's from South Park. They're sort of like, step 1, steal underwear. Step 2, step 3, profit. And that's kind of like with Marxism. It's like, criticize capitalism to make it sound bad, or whatever version of capitalism we're talking about. Step 2, step 3, communist utopia. And they kind of fall, I think, in that same type of reasoning, where it's like, yeah, you can criticize something a lot, and all the criticism that the Marxists have of capitalism is valid. And again, the system Russia has is sort of a weird hybrid now of a few different things. So even just saying capitalism, like some sort of like Ron Paul libertarian capitalism, you know, deserves criticism. Every system deserves criticism, even the really organic ones like we have today. But just because you could criticize something, it doesn't necessarily prove that communism is the case, right? And I think that's sort of a logical flaw that a lot of these people have. Is they're like, well, you know, the really, really rich guys control the means of production, and that's bad. Yeah, I guess that does kind of suck. But, well, if we do communism, the means of production will go to the people. Okay, how many people in the Soviet Union were able to sort of like go somewhere and get their own t-shirts printed? Or, if they had a really good idea for something, could they get a loan from a bank to start a business? And do it themselves? You know, who actually really controlled the means of production in the Soviet Union? The Constitution of 1936 would say the people, but I didn't see the Soviets asking average Ivan, who's working at some car factory, what he thinks of the cars they're making, or what cars they should make, or whether production should be expanded or not. He just worked and told at that factory like a guy in a capitalist country, only the guy in a capitalist country got to have more stuff for his labor. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. I don't get it, because this whole thing about like on the means of production. Also, one of my least favorite sort of intellectual tropes is working class identity. That there's some sort of mysterious working class identity that we all actually have, but it kind of has to be unlocked. So it's a natural thing that all people are part of this, all, you know, except for the evil elite 1%. We all have this working class identity, and that it has to be, you know, unlocked. And when it is unlocked, that's our actual natural state of being, and that's somehow been taken away from us or oppressed. It's like, no, that's not the way it is. I don't think that's really the way that human beings particularly operate. Because if another thing about communism is, okay, let's take Russia again. Go back to, it's Tim Kirby Russia, not Tim Kirby anywhere else. Okay, well, you know what happens is the Soviet Union collapses. the Soviet Union organized a lot of things that would be sort of collective, right? Different workers' collectives and artist collectives and all this other stuff. And of course, the ever famous collective farms. Well, that would be a really good test. So we get into this sort of really troublesome time period in Russian history. However, if you're working the land and selling food, that's something that is eternally in demand by human beings. So what happened to all the collective farms? They all fell apart. Everyone killed all the animals for the most part, ate them, and yeah. So why don't these collectives work? Because human beings don't really think collectively. We think in a hierarchy. We like to have our leaders. We like to have our Putins, our Trumps, our Xis. Some people even like their Bidens and Harrises and Obamas, and so on and so forth. I think it's human nature for there to be a hierarchical pyramid, and when we try to pretend that it isn't there, you can't get anything done. You need to have somebody sort of be the decider and the organizer. Even not within the government, but within the people of the Soviet Union, there was a joke that on the collective farm, you only need 2 smart people. One guy to run it, and then one guy to take over after he dies. I don't know, kind of morbid, but that's ultimately the truth. Because again, when the Soviet Union collapsed, everything that was sort of collective or semi-collective completely fell apart. Another good example of this is we tried to get a playground put somewhere around my house. We tried to make a collective decision where no one has any authority, right? Because you could say the guy who is sort of like the head of the homeowners association or whatever, he could have authority. But in Russia, the homeowners associations have zero power. Zero. Okay? It's a voluntary agreement, and that agreement can't trump Russian law, even local law. So they're pointless. But so anyways, when we tried to make all these agreements and do all this, well, there seemed to be too many different factions, and no one could agree on anything. So we have a collective of people who own homes. They're all next to each other. They all know each other even, for the most part. And yet no decision could be reached, so nothing got done. And even with the Soviet Union, that's still the thing where you talked about equality. Well, again, equality. 10% of the population had party membership. So you had, within the Soviet Union, you still had this very, sort of pyramidal society where you had sort of the working masses. You had, 10% of the party, the population was in the party. And then you get up to people, like in the Politburo and the actual real halls of power, the KGB or whatever, the military, who actually had real power and really made decisions. And although their lives were maybe in an economic sense kind of similar to everyone else's, there were still a lot of privileges and there was still a lot of power dynamics that were not really spread around. So again, there's still some people in Russia who have some fond memories of the Soviet Union, and I can kind of understand why. I can even kind of explain why. So if you do talk to Russians and they are the small, well, not small, they're that maybe 20% of the population, which may be 15% soon, that is not just sort of romantic about communism in some ways of that, like, this was a very powerful period and there was a lot of good, artwork and design, and during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was important, and we did some big things, maybe the Soviet economy definitely didn't give you the nicest furniture, but it got dogs and a guy into space, it was able to accomplish some big things too. So there's some people who have this sort of fondness for it, but I'm not really talking about people who have fondness of like a nostalgic type. I'm talking more about people who would want to go back. And that's, like I said, 15% of the population. And the real reason is, again, like I told you, was talking about earlier, but it bears repeating because it comes up all the time, but in the Soviet Union, everything was free. The education was free. The housing was free. No, it wasn't. You had to work 40 hours a week or you'd go to jail. Potentially even get shot, depending on the circumstances, right? So, yeah. So that's it. You have this sort of bizarre thing where people who are first off really the sort of the losers of Russian society. So you're a loser of Russian society, and you combine that with being kind of dim, and it repeats the same thing in America. The people who are sort of losers in America, who are also dim, But if we do communism, it'll be free. Everything will be free. It'll be free. It's good. It's good advertising. It works. It's kind of like when we go back to again, this whole thing about like people where they say that because people are like people under communism are greedy. That's some also weird American talking point. Not really. In fact, no. I don't think it's a greed thing. It's what before our friends in Berlin in the 1930s kind of took and manipulated his ideas. What Nietzsche was actually talking about when he made this sort of like Übermensch and Untermensch, like the greater man and the lesser man, right? So with the greater man, he created two types. I'm not the greatest Nietzsche expert of greater men and two types of lesser men, but ultimately the greater man pursues his own destiny, and the lesser man despises the greater man and essentially works to destroy his destiny, right? And I really see that in like modern day communists in Russia. It's just sort of like they're on the losing end of the stick and they're unable to change their status in life. So if I can't live well and do all this cool stuff that the new system offers, we need to bring it down. And that goes back to the whole St. Petersburg thing of we're not going to build new apartments right now. We're going to take from the rich and subdivide their apartments and homes and all this other stuff and shove people into them against their will despite them. Very Untermensch way of thinking. And that's another reason why I can't, despite my colorful shirt today, that's another reason why I really do not support the return of communism. Because you could really see that Nietzschean Untermensch attitude. And that's kind of the person that the system rewards. The kind of person who just kind of sits at the bottom and wants everything given to them. Because again, I think for a lot of people, all right, let's Tim Kirby Russia hardcore. Let's go hardcore. This is one theory I don't talk about too much, but at this point, who knows? Maybe tomorrow I'll get shot, so I might as well share it. I actually think that overall, like this whole politics and governmental structures and how people live, my personal way of viewing the world, which I'm sure someone else has presented this idea throughout the many thousands of years of recorded human history, but I haven't heard it anywhere else. So it sounds fresh. Let's just say I'm not original. I'm kind of fresh with it. That ultimately, everything is kind of the same. Only some of the like superficial packaging changes. And again, we're going to mention Richard Wolff. He's even talks about how, during the mercantile period or you talk about like the Industrial Revolution, we went from having serfs and landowners to having, I have to use his cadence, to having employers and employees, right? So if you looked at human history, whether it was the sort of peasantry or slaves of like the ancient world, we get into the sort of lords and various ruling class, the aristocracy of medieval times and their serfs. And then you get into the Industrial Revolution where you have the industrialists or the capitalists, the people with the big money, and then the rest of the labor force, the workers, and who even knows what to call people anymore today. But essentially, society kind of looks the same. You kind of have like about 80% of the population being the kind of big working masses, be they working the fields, or working some lathe in a factory, or working Microsoft Word on a computer, or slinging Starbucks as we move into a service economy. Ultimately, the overwhelming majority of people toil. Then you get into some of this sort of higher, sort of mid-echelon of what, like something 15 or whatever, more percent of the population who are kind of like the upper middle class, who are the sort of thinkers, successful sort of tradesmen, traders with a D, not a T, warriors, the military, and then you get into sort of like the clergy or propaganda machine, and into the actual aristocracy and the leadership. So that sort of pyramid existed throughout, and exists to this day, throughout all of human history. It is the way we are, and under communism, it was the same thing. The overwhelming, absolute, total majority of people were essentially workers or peasants or serfs. It doesn't matter what you call them. They all fulfill the same function. And then there was the sort of 10%-ish Communist Party, and then a very small sort of inner Communist Party, to use the Orwellian terminology for it. And so nothing's different. And again, going back to this goofy system where the toiling masses have a lot less than they have now, especially in terms of, let's just say, fun and nice living conditions, even though you have to work really hard for it. No. And it is not worth it. It is not worth it. And so essentially what I also mean is that one of the big arguments for a communist revolution, and yes, for the 2 Russian people who are listening, I know in Russia they always called it socialism because socialism is the step before communism. I know, but in English we don't talk that way, so fuck off. Okay, just keep your Russian comments to yourself. All right. But anyways, so one of the big arguments of why we would need communism is that it creates some sort of equality, and then it gets rid of these classes, and it creates a society of all one class. No, it didn't. No, it didn't fucking do it. Not anywhere. Not in Cuba, not in the Soviet Union, not in Maoist China, or that sort of, was it the Deng Xiaoping China, or not Xi China, the cool modern one that's more open and fun, and full of delicious food and culture and all that shit. Nor in North Korea. It didn't happen anywhere. Okay? And just because maybe the salaries of the Politburo members kind of looked similar to the salaries of potentially other people, or the fact that one of the better jobs in the Soviet Union was driving like friggin' trolleys in terms of your salary, it did not create some sort of class of society. Human beings exist in a class-full society by default, as I just mentioned. It is throughout all of human history. There's never an exception to it. Not in liberalism in the West, or whatever the hell kind of system we have in Russia here, which is beyond definition. Not under socialism, communism, not under nationalism in Germany or Italy, or, again, whatever the hell Japan was. Not in the era of great kings and sheikhs and all these other people with amazing headpieces and glorious outfits. It's all the same. So, essentially, all the things that, again, all we do is we have some comments. I'll get to them. But ultimately, living in Russia, it's really proven to me that communism was not, some people can make an argument that it made some maybe necessary changes in Russia. I don't know about that, but I can say for one thing is that it is just less efficient and less good for the average person. It really kind of orients towards the lowest common denominator, and I think Russia is much better off without it, and the proof is in the pudding. Because, again, like I just said a few minutes ago, when the West did all the sanctions and international pressure and containment and all that other crap, it worked. And now, the country that's even smaller, with a smaller population, so technically less resources, even though there's a frickin' ton of them, no problem. The proof's in the pudding. So, there you go. Let's see. Let's take a look at some comments here, and I really hope that the Russian people who comment are going to comment without using the typical 6 to 10 things they always say about communism. Then again, it could be interesting, because if you move here, you're going to hear them over and over and over again. But the educational system was so good. Could you explain in what ways was it good? It was just better. Okay. Everything in the Soviet Union was free. Free education. Free this. Free that. Okay. Cool. Okay, it was free. Well, did you have to work? Yes. Anyways. Contra, I always say this wrong. I'm sorry. Contra veritatem mundi. With a thick American accent. Why anyone would prefer to learn Russian history from anyone except historic ethnic Russians who are Protestant. They are founded and have always been the legitimate rulers of Russian land. It's their histories beyond me. Why learn history from anyone else? I've read way too many records of Bolsheviks with his same last name, Yakovlev. No thanks. I am confused. Wait. Oh, this is a response. Oh my gosh. Hold on. That was a response to a previous post. Excuse me for being stupid. I am very much in old man mode. So, this is Vitaly writes, by the way, to all those who speak Russian and want to learn Russian history and much more, here's the channel of the winner of a prestigious Znanie, the knowledge, Best Educator Award, Yegor Yakovlev. His guests are always experts in specific historical topics. He himself is an expert on 1917, Russian Civil War, and Nazi genocide of the Soviet people. Okay. And I guess Mr. Mundi, I know his, in real life, I know he's not Mundi, but that's easier to say. He disagrees with that. Well, yeah, dude. Well, here's one thing. On the Russian internet, the interpretation of Russian history, like I've told you before, the Western interpretation of Russian history is Solzhenitsyn mania. You take Solzhenitsyn and you crank it up to 11. You crank that all the negatives about Russian history that I don't even say history. You take the things that Solzhenitsyn said, true, false, somewhere in between. You run with that because it makes Russia seem like a shithole. You just take it and run. That's the American version, or Western. Within Russia, you definitely have some people who have this very romantic, extremely gushy interpretation of history that really, it's almost like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union wrote, well, they did kind of write their own history, but it's kind of like they wrote it again, right? And of course, then you have a lot of historians who are much more in favor of, as Mr. Mundi mentioned, the more, let's just say, imperial orthodox view of Russian history, and they have a vastly different interpretation. So there's a bit of a battle for Russian history within Russia, but I think it's good that we can discuss these things, and it's good that there's some, let's just say, these are discussed. It's always scary when you get to the point where things are sort of, it has to be this way, it can only be this way, how dare you say anything against it? That's always kind of dangerous. So I think some of these discussions are good. Of course, I have a strong feeling that Mr. Mundi and I are probably fairly strongly in agreement on our interpretation of Russian history through the more orthodox lens. But again, only God is in heaven, so I don't know everything, and perhaps our pro-Soviet colleagues might know a thing or two. Anne wants to talk. Hello, Anne. You can talk, and anyone else who wants to call in can call in. Hello.
Okay.
And remember,
Thank
guys,
you.
to use the call-in feature, you just have to click on something when you click on your own name. But anyways, Anne, what's your question for today?
Right. You can hear me, right?
Very well.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a great topic. I just tuned in. And as you answer people, I would love it if you could answer these questions that, that I and many others have. During the communist period, you mentioned that people were forced to work.
Everybody.
Question. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, question. Understanding is that they were told what jobs they would do. They didn't have a choice. And
No,
also,
that was like that's a weird, complex kind of organic thing that I'm not really an expert on. But no one could put a gun to your head and make you become a graphic designer. Like, if you wanted to be a designer, I don't quite know how you would do that, but they had, like, design schools and medical, by school I mean universities and stuff, like, and for doctors and medical practitioners. So people had specializations. So I think it was a matter of kind of getting your specialization, but no, they couldn't kind of, unless you were like some sort of alcoholic, and then it was kind of like either you sweep up the floor at the theater or you'll go to jail. That's for that kind of person, like the real dregs of society. They didn't have much choice because they just sort of had to do something. And if you had absolutely no qualifications to do anything, sweep.
okay. Weren't they also assigned to education? I'm talking early on, when the whole thing, well, not, 30s or whatever, they were assigned also, they couldn't choose their education freely. If the communists decided they wanted to be a teacher, that's what you had to study.
No. There was really no way to kind of like force people to do that. I can say that one thing is, you really had to be sort of qualified in terms of like getting into a university. It wasn't like, well, thanks to the government backing like college or student loans in America, you could kind of do whatever you want, even if it was pointless, and use the loan to go get a degree. In the Soviet Union, there was competition to get those sweet, like, again, well, to be honest, the sweetest job was driving the trolleys. But like if you wanted to be a doctor, there was only so many spots, available. Everything was by quota, so you had to get the best sort of testing and other results to get the nod to be, accepted into a university for that position. So,
Oh, okay, two more, two more question comments. And just hear them first before you answer. Um, so I'd like you at some point to explain. You mentioned something once about the intelligentsia, and one sees comments that most of the intelligentsia was killed off, and I guess this must have been back in the 30s or so, maybe before the time that people you're talking about who like communism,
mm-hmm.
appreciated their particular lives, but the intelligentsia was very much killed off. And then my last comment is,
Well, wait, hold on.
um,
Before you get to your last comment, I don't understand what you mean about the intelligence. So, well, the one thing is, it kind of depends on how you define this, because there's that famous book that was also a movie that was good from the Soviet Union, called A Dog's Heart, and it's kind of about like, it's kind of a rib on the early Soviet power and how they didn't know what the hell they were doing. I just watched this fantastic kind of podcast documentary about how many times Lenin changed his mind about his policies during his life. It's amazing. So essentially, that movie kind of, or that book, really ribs on how people didn't know what the hell they were doing. So in a lot of ways, the sort of, let's just say, intellectuals of the Russian Empire, yeah, a lot of them suffered, or they had to leave Russia because they were all tied to the regime. So yeah, they were in deep shit when there was a revolution, as is the case. The big intellectuals of any particular movement, if there's a revolution, they're going to be kind of enemy number one. But the Soviet Union then had its own intellectuals, rise up. There was definitely an intellectual class. There was even sort of an intellectual class in the 90s in Russia, if you think about it, and there is today. So there's always going to be that group of people who are like hyper focused on ideas and politics, and for some reason their dad is someone important, so they don't have to work very much, if at all. And yeah, that group of people is always going to be present. It goes back to my theory about how society is always very similar. It just sort of, maybe some of these superficial kind of things change, but ultimately we remain the same that we've been since human beings created any sort of quasi nation state. Your last
okay,
comment?
right. Last comment is people who do support communism there. How do they justify really the mass killings that occurred early on? Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right after 1917, there were just mass killings, and when you say in the intelligentsia, whatever, right, but they selectively. I mean, may I? Is the term White Russian valid still? I mean, they killed off the intelligentsia of the White Russians, correct? And
Well,
and so how can
it also depends how you look at it, because there was a lot of infighting, and also there was the first revolution where the Tsar went away, and then you had the Kerensky. I think that's the Kerensky, I think is the way to say it. His government, which was sort of like liberal for a few months before the communists kind of took over. But remember, they were divided. There was like the SR party and the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and there were a few. It wasn't quite homogenous, especially during the very beginning. So it all sort of congealed into one big party later. In fact, in North Korea, the minor parties, that because their history is sort of similar to the Russian Revolution, except with the Russians, the minor parties just vanished off the face of the map. They were all absorbed or whatever. Whereas in North Korea, their minority parties are they're still technically there. Same ones that were there during the revolution. They have a teeny tiny spattering of seats, and they all do a lot of butt kissing of the regime, but they're still there, which is, I think, an interesting minor historical difference. But
right,
yeah, but one thing you have to say is, when you're talking about like the massacres of people and this, that, and the other, and you get into Russia, the problem is, remember, in the West, when we talk about the violence of the Russian Revolution, if you were to read certain Russian, let's just say, authors and historians, Stalin's terror, as it's the overarching sort of term, killed, in their opinion, between 600,000 and 1 million people, something like that. Okay, including people who were executed for abusing the public. So the people who were causing abuse were killed off. Okay, and the question is why? Because the revolution was a very desperate time. So when you look at Russia, especially through a Russian history, whether it be the sort of the more Soviet one or the more Orthodox one or whoever, the Soviet period is a lot more gray, and a lot of people did die in the Russian Revolution, but the sort of counter-terror, it did kill a significant amount of people, but it wasn't anything like what was portrayed in the West. People who are really bitter about the Russian Revolution are two groups. Number one, the Cossacks. Because I believe they really wanted to break up the Cossacks. They were too religious, too sort of, let's just say, independent, too well armed. And so a lot of the Cossacks were killed. I think something like 3,500 Cossacks within just one sort of host, I believe is the English term for one group of Cossacks were killed that I talked to. So, but again, we're talking about deaths in the thousands, which is still a tragedy. It's still horrible, but it's a much smaller number. The other group that's really still bitter about communism are the Chechens, because they were deported. Many of them were deported to Kazakhstan, especially around World War II. However, in their opinion, they were loyal. They remained loyal to Russia, and yet they were completely fucked over. So the Chechens hate Stalin, and they hate communism, and so do the Cossacks. They hate it universally almost. So if you want to talk about groups within Russia, they hate it, but the current government is not that. So there's no problem. In fact, the Cossacks feel very free to do as they please, and to an extent they've been rearmed and restored. And a lot of the Chechens have gone back to Chechnya after communism ended. They were free to live where they want. Oh, that's another thing about communism. You don't really have the freedom to live where you want. Kind of. You can, because you can sort of accept a job or not, but let's just say, where you're living really isn't 100% your choice. It kind of is, but kind of isn't. But after communism ended, yeah, a lot of the Chechens went back home. Because I was kind of even curious if the West would at some point put Russia to the test by trying to maybe attack or massacre the Chechen population in Kazakhstan as like some sort of way to, again, drive some sort of rift. Because it's like, it would basically force Putin to either have to attack Kazakhstan, which is a soft ally and would cause a lot of problems, or then piss off the Chechens. So basically, you kind of turn one of these two major important parts of the Russian universe into an enemy, but there's all the Chechens left. The amount of Chechens in Kazakhstan is nominal. Putin could click his fingers and just buy them all plane tickets. There's freaking a couple thousand people. That's it. And I guess they're there because they just want to be there, and they don't, that's where they are. They don't care. So thankfully, that potential, because I wanted to write maybe an article about that or do a video, but they all went back home. So.
Okay, thank you.
All right, moving on. Someone else wanted to talk, and now they don't. All right, that's amazing. Oh yes, Sam wants to talk. Hello, Sam. You love to filibuster those questions. Let's keep it to one or two today, and let's also keep it to communism in terms of Russia in the 21st century, or the
okay.
Communist period.
Yeah. Basically, what I've concluded, I read a lot of history, and you can't really understand world history unless you understand the history of the Orthodox Church. So I'd recommend to Anne look at some Orthodox historians if she wants to know what happened during World War I and prior. But basically, the intelligentsia were the equivalent of the woke college students right now.
Mm-hmm.
They were coffee-drinking losers that would hang out at salons with the critical theory of breaking down society, but not a good idea of what to replace it with. And basically, they were the useless idiots of international Jewry, which use the Bolshevik
they're the Untermensch. They're the people who hate that others have a destiny. So they focus on, rather than creating their own destiny of some sort, their real desire is to break down the destiny of other people. So again, I'm not the Lord of Nietzsche. I don't pretend to have a philosophy degree, but I think that model of behavior, boy, do you see it a lot in real life. So, but anyways.
Yeah, right. And so what the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was used for by international Jewry is to do a transfer of wealth from Russia the last Orthodox nation, the last nation without serious usury and without a central bank that was predatory towards the people.
Yeah.
Lenin used the banker, I forget his last name. He was a Swedish banker named Olaf, and basically wiped out the wealth, the assets of Russia within 5 years. So between 1917 and 1922, the agricultural output, all of the exports of Soviet Russia collapsed, and
Well, yeah,
and it was
the whole sanctions
transferred.
thing was set in, but yeah. Well, dude, any revolution. Well, the one thing is, it's like, okay, how good was the French economy during the French Revolution? Probably not so great. You know what I mean? That's kind of the nature of revolution, is it really breaks things down to be rebuilt back up, and that's why I'm generally not an advocate for revolution, because we've seen that every time that pretty much all revolutions, in fact, I might even say all of them, it's never worth it.
They're Masonic. These revolutions are Masonic. They're basically orchestrated
Well,
by.
here, let's pick our conspiracy theories. Some people believe that Peter the Great and the people around him were Masonic. So you're saying that Lenin and his revolutionaries were. Who is the winner? Who are the real Freemasons? And who are the fake ones or not Freemasons?
Well, Freemasonry is Judaism for the Gentile. It uses the same Kabbalah type of.
Well, in the Russian
imagery
instance, one group killed the other and took away their power. So which was it? Was it the communist revolutions were the Freemasons, or was it Peter the Great's following sort of inner circle that also wanted to sell Russia to the West?
Yeah, there were definitely agents that were okay. Peter the Great was long gone when the 1917 revolution
Of course,
took
but
place.
I'm talking about Russian conspiracy theories. So there's a lot of
Okay,
Masonic
I don't know
symbolism.
those in depth.
A lot of Masonic symbolism in St. Petersburg from the time of his life and generations after that.
I would definitely say there was a holdover group of Western, idealists of the West that remained in Russia, and they were a fifth column that allowed for the intelligentsia base to grow. I think you could read about it, like Pope.
I'll put it this way: if you ask President Putin, he said himself that 85% of the revolutionaries in Russia were not Russians. That he said that I think maybe even multiple times, and so Putin would maybe confirm that the revolution wasn't to serve the interest of Russians and had a very heavy influence from without. So, but you'd have to talk to him about that. So.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
All right. Well, there you go. We're in agreement. All right, man. Okay. Anyways, Ann, one more question you wanted to get in before we get to comments. And remember, everyone, if you comment anywhere, I'll see it and we'll read them. It's Read Comment Time Mania. And one more thing you wanted to say? No? Yes? No.
Yes, thanks. Really important clarification for you and Sam. When I say intelligentsia, maybe I'm misinformed. I mean educated people like engineers and doctors and Christians.
No, engineers are not the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia are the group of intellectuals who really sort of put together like the foundation of different ideas. Like the people in Harvard and Yale and whatever who are feminists, who all sit around and write books about how it would be amazing if all men were killed. That's like an intelligentsia. An engineer builds stuff. He's not part of the intelligentsia. He makes stuff.
Yeah. That's completely different than the concept I was talking about. I want you and Sam to know that. So I'll
maybe you're referring to something like civil society, of like people who are of a certain intellectual acumen where they actually contribute to society, because civil society is a much more broad concept, but it's also kind of a concept that I don't really know if it's necessarily true or not.
I mean, a lot of Christians were killed is my point too, right?
That is correct, especially priests.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Sam, one more thing? One last question or comment?
Yeah. Okay, I understand where Ann's coming from, and I meant to say this. Yeah. We were taught wrong about who the intelligentsia was in the basic textbooks. I remember this very clearly because as I started studying Russian history from the Orthodox perspective, the Western history books, what is the word? They confound, or they mix up who is the intelligentsia in order for the Western reader, the Western mind, to say, oh, these people are very useful. No, the intelligentsia were not engineers. These are engineers are people that are too busy living lives functionally, building things.
Yeah.
They don't have time to sit around and plan a revolution and plan overthrowing a society that they're actual functional members of. They're succeeding in. So that's where the
well, again,
confusion comes
we're
in.
talking about communism. Karl Marx is the sort of hero of the proletariat. He wasn't a member of the proletariat. He wasn't a working class person. He didn't work a fucking lathe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
exactly. And
again,
I like what you.
Yeah. Listen. Hold on.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna mute you because now we're starting going to cacophony mode. But anyways, that's another thing that people need to be aware of. And this is also talking from someone who might be partially in the intelligentsia of Russia to an extent. So I can sort of tell you that one of the problems is that people who are really able to work on sort of ideological projects are always going to be a little bit distant from the masses. You can get people who are like Putin or Nazarbayev or Lukashenko, who all came from sort of normal backgrounds, but certainly now they're detached because they're in power. Well, Nazarbayev's retired, but still, he's not one of the guys on the bus anymore. And so the intelligentsia has become very dangerous with its ideas, because it's really the ideas that represent people who have, I guess, a lot of free time to think. You know what I mean? But if you even go back into ancient history, well, why were there Greek philosophers instead of ancient Germanic philosophers? You know? Why that? Why weren't there like sub-Saharan African philosophers? Why Greece and why China? In fact, well, in India too. In India, they had a lot of religious stuff going on, and that whole the whole Hammurabi's code and the code with the Tigris and the Euphrates and all that. Because those were like the great river civilizations: the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, and the Yellow River in China and all that. Well, so with the great societies came enough people who could sit around and think about stuff. And that's where our ideas were born from. So the original intelligentsia came from some sort of level of prosperity, which ancient Germanic, pre-Roman Empire, ancient Germanic tribes and sub-Saharan Africans and people we call today Brazilians, they didn't have that shit. You know, they didn't have it. They had to fight to survive. They were toiling, almost all of them, right? So again, intelligentsia, and that's one of the problems with the prosperity of the West, which creates that sort of cyclical effect, is a lot of the people who are the driving force ideologically are people who are very distant from survival. They're distant from reality, and they're sort of in this look at the world through their own sort of lens stuff, and that's one of the dangers of the intelligentsia. And I even see that within the sort of Russian intelligentsia that's here today, which is took over from the liberals, wants to do good. But it's very, very, it still suffers where its head is up its ass. Like, how many times I just have to go in there and tell these guys, like, look, the Bolshoi Theater is fine. Dostoevsky, brilliant man. That's not the entirety of Russian culture. That is, you can throw as much Dostoevsky at the West as you want, and it's not going to change a fucking thing. And you really have to beat into them, because their heads are up their ass, because they sit around and they want this haute couture sort of Russia, where everyone's in suits with ties, official handshaking, lots of nice fancy government logos, lots of Bolshoi theater, lots of, haute couture, and they think that that's what Russian culture is, and then that somehow that's going to be this language of diplomacy with the West. It's like, no. So even people who are in the intelligentsia, who I think have very good hearts, and they're definitely, their heart is in the right place 100%, they still fall into the trap of viewing things from some weird intelligentsia zone that doesn't really match reality and take into account especially how people who have a different mentality from them think. It's the same fucking thing. And that's why I'm nuts. That's why I'm absolutely nuts. And can't control my mouth anymore. Anyways, Bakani is writing a question. Again, if anyone wants to call in, I forget how it looks like for you guys, but there's something you click on that'll allow you to raise your hand and you can call in. So you get some new people calling in to talk about communism in Russia and especially post-communist Russia. Bokani, I guess communists were the first to do the space stuff. Apart from that, nothing much, I believe. Well, another talking point when you talk to Russians about communism is they all say stuff like, well, the first cell phone was made in the Soviet Union. The first cell phone was made in the Soviet Union. Technically true. What did they do with it? I mean, it was just used by the military. And like everything else, like even video games in the Soviet Union were made by the military. So there actually were some major scientific developments, and again, but besides space and other things, but nothing was ever like converted for public use. That's what the West was very good at, and Russia wasn't. However, that tendency of looking at something and being able to sort of use it further has kind of come over from the West. So, and essentially also the economic system here now allows people to take new ideas and try to do new things and become more adaptive. So, yeah. But yeah, but we invented the cell phone. Well, then why aren't all the cell phones in the world called something like Yantar or something like that? Why not? Oh, because you had it and you didn't do shit with it. Vitaly says, the communists created the first nuclear power plant. I'm not sure about that one. But they definitely were in it was either them or the United States. And anti-communists were the only people to use a nuclear bomb on civilians. Okay. I guess that's a kind of interesting talking point. I'll put it this way. How many nuclear warheads did the Soviet Union produce? Think about it that way. Who wanted to cause a world revolution to change the entire world to believe in one system? Well, I know Stalin wanted socialism in one country, but he wasn't he wasn't the atypical communist, because communists believe that any sort of end justifies the means justify the end in terms of creating communist revolution anywhere. And I am sure that if given a chance, Lenin would have used nuclear bombs against whoever. In fact, Mr. Mundi is now fighting against Vitaly. That's right. It was the Soviet communists applied economics that was a nuclear bomb of a different sort. Amazing how the immense wealth of our beloved Tsar's family was squandered so fast, and how much it was made us back to Western instigators. Yeah, the Soviet Union really did destroy all the wealth of Russia, and but what the Soviets could do was propaganda, so they made it seem and made people believe as if there was just nothing here before the Soviet Union came. Bakani continues, to be honest, the Western conservative talking points about how people like Biden, Harris, Obama are commies is pretty lame. If Stalin, Lysenko, Enver, Hoxha were alive now, they would not vote for those guys. Well, Stalin is kind of hated by other people who are like modern day communists because of the way he was and because he was different. And if you, like I mentioned, there's a lot of views on a certain thing. I don't know. Maybe it's, I don't know. That's kind of getting into word games. I'm going to pass on that one. Sober Riot. Glad that mistake didn't happen again in the 90s. Oh, wait. Oh, about the loss of Russia's wealth. So, well, yeah, but you could also blame that just that revolution is bad. And that's why, again, why I said, guys, why, despite the fact that people want to label me as some kind of American dissident, if there's a revolution in America, it is going to suck ass. It is going to be a nightmare upon nightmares, because the population is very big, and the population is very tied to plastic food from Walmart. And when that falls apart, it is going to be ugly if that happens. And that's why I don't advocate for it, because man, it's gonna be horrific. Anyways, Lydia Stano, why are Westerners so obsessed with commies? That implies that Lydia is from somewhere in Russia. I don't know. You'd have to ask all the people who kept discussing communism over the last 2 weeks on my channel. Ask them why they're obsessed. Vitaly, yep, Russia officially recognized the Tsar's debts after the breakup of the USSR and paid them in full in 4 tranches. The last payment was made in 1997. That's pointless. Communism, Bocani continues. Communism also evolved into some nationalistic, you mean the Nats Bowls, in certain countries. For instance, Albania, which was communist, had nationalist tendencies mainly implemented by the Enver Hoxha, the Communist Party of Albania from 1945-1985, I think. He was also kind of anti-abortion, increased the... Well, yeah, I believe at some point during Stalin they got rid of abortion, and now they're clamping down on it again. The whole abortion and death penalty thing in Russia has kind of gone on and off. It was not consistent. So let's hope that we choose life on both ends, and because the whole death penalty thing is it's messy. You can't undo it. I don't know. Let's live without it. Let's see. The Butovo... that's not related to this. At least one reason is that the Soviet Union... Wait, why are people so obsessed with commies? At least one reason that the Soviet Union did a very effective job of seeding higher education in the West with it. Kinda, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. And, I guess people could be obsessed with it because it's seemingly the only alternative, you know? And it has the free stuff, and everyone will be equal, and I'll have power as a normie. The Untermensch mentality. Lydia continues, I wished I could see the higher education in the West. I live in Western Europe. Nobody even talks about it. Nobody talks about communism in Western Europe? Are you sure about that? There's a lot of socialism in Europe. Maybe Americans, some other Westerners, or Anglo-Saxons need this image of commies to form their own identity, like we invented freedom. Why aren't you obsessed with your own history? Americans are obsessed with their own history because the entire worldview of U.S. foreign policy and the actions that America takes is and even wokeism is completely formed by looking at the world only through one particular type of Americo-centric view. So, Lydia, you're wrong. They are obsessed with their own history, and no one gives a shit about Russia's interpretation of its own history. Not one shit. E.J. What about the communist idea of today in Russia, which is defending more redistribution of public services using examples of what they think worked better than the Soviet Union? Is it possible to distinguish Bolshevik Revolution period from the post-war Soviet Union, which had functioning society, which people... Well, yeah, was communism different after World War II? Yeah. Because, well, actually, really, 1937 kind of ended the Russian Revolution. So after about 20 years, 1937 and the purges was the end of that. And from that point on, the Soviet Union was politically stable. And so then you get into the chaos of World War II. And after Stalin dies, that's when you get into the nice, boring, but stable, with apartments, a little bit of fun, and enough food to eat for sure. The Soviet Union that people long for, because the Russians talk about like what they like about the Soviet Union, it is always the second half. It is always the second half when life was a little bit more easier and stable. No one is like, yeah, let's go back to like the 1920s where everyone was really, really fucked over and had nowhere to live. Yeah, like, they don't talk about that. It's always the second half. And also the half of the Soviet Union that had the more iconic movies that people still watch to this day. Thomas adds, nope, that's not related. This is also not related. Lydia, I agree with you, Tim. Obsessed with the own history to look down on everybody else. I probably should have been able to guess that would be the word down. Well, kind of. I mean, if you go and build your political beliefs on your own one perspective, first off, that's kind of natural, to be honest, for most people. But, you know, you live on a planet with a lot of people who had different experiences, so it's kind of, yeah. I guess you skipped my last comment, Tim. I don't know. What was your last comment? I'm neither communist nor capitalist, whatever they call it, but for both of them to talk about the mass killings is just the same as two people stabbing each other, and they both die. Communism, who killed who? Human beings are violent, and when it comes to politics, when it comes to ideas. Where again, let's go to Dugin, who believes that liberalism is in the Western democracy machine, liberalism, whatever. Nationalism, which could also be related to the stuff in Germany in the 1930s and all that, and communism, they're all totalitarian. They're each totalitarian in a different way. And we definitely see that now in the West, that the West is having problems. It is, everything was about being open and free markets and all that. Wait, other countries can make social media networks? Die. It is purely and completely totalitarian. All of them. All three of them. And so the pot calls the kettle black because the pot likes its political movement and the kettle is a different political movement. So the kettle is bad even though it's just as black. That's what this is about. So any side is willing to commit violence for its political beliefs, especially if those beliefs are inherently like universalist. That's the real Dugin term. Universalist and totalitarian. It's as if he's sitting in the room with us right now. So yeah. That's how it goes. Okay, well, guys, it looks like there's no calls and no more messages. And I think I kind of tried to share all the stories I could. So I guess we'll do a recap. Maybe some messages will appear. Maybe someone will call in. But again, I can tell you one thing, is that when you talk to people who, again, maybe I should say that some of the positives of communism, again, were... it was very predictable, and a lot of people who, maybe if you feel in your life a real lack of stability, you don't know what tomorrow will bring, communism really offered that, life might be kind of like a 6 out of 10, but it's going to be a 6 out of 10 tomorrow and the day after. That a lot of people liked. And they also like the guarantee of, it's like, if I work at this factory for 7 years, I'll get an apartment that looks like this. It's guaranteed. And I know I'm going to be able to afford to eat for sure. Stuff like that. So it was stable. And one of the things with the way that economy worked is, as we now see people all over the world have to go to different places to work, right? There's all sorts of migrant labor, and people can't make money where they were born. Whereas under communism, you kind of can. I mean, if you're like a school teacher, your salary is going to be exactly the same in rural Uzbekistan as it is in the center of Moscow. So you could kind of make do wherever you wanted to live, including a weird, isolated place. So there are definitely some positives to it. I'm not going to say it was all negative, but yeah. So that we covered that. But again, if people are going to argue about this whole communism thing, they're going to talk about, and things you can bring up is they're going to say, but equality, everyone was equal. No, they weren't, and they never will be. Human beings live in a hierarchy. Deal with it. It's all of human history. That's number one. We've talked already a few times. Everyone had to work, so there was no free stuff. You just paid for it in a different way. The masses toiled, as they always do. Yeah, those are kind of the real prime arguments. And yeah, so people make up a lot of stuff about like the Soviet Union, but trust me, everything in Russia is better without it. So overall. Anyways, guys, so I guess I'm gonna hit the road then. No comments, no nothing. All right, later on. It was nice talking to you.